You are live.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. This is the Joint Legislative Management Committee meeting on Monday, December 5th. This morning, we have two HR policies to review and hopefully vote on. And then I have a request around an allocation of a vacant position for the Speaker's office. So that's the agenda for this morning, and we'll start with the remote work policy. If we can have Arlene come on up. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Arlene Donovan from Human Resources. So I think this morning you should have two policies in front of you. The first is the remote work policy, and I think if you don't mind, I'll start with that one. The next one is a revision of the COVID-19 policy for staff. Just as a little bit of background, as a refresher, the remote work policy is a policy that has been in place already for about a year. This is a revision of that policy because the last one was written at the peak of the pandemic. It was over 10 pages long. This one has been significantly changed. And, I'm sorry, the COVID-19 policy is 10 pages long. The remote work policy it's not 10 pages long, thankfully, but it still is 3 pages long. But it has been revised to be updated for many of the challenges that we continue to face as a result of the pandemic. We still have childcare issues. We still have school closures, classroom closures, elder care issues. People are still becoming ill. Now we have RSV running through preschools and classrooms and closing those schools. There's just a lot of uncertainty that exists and doesn't really seem to be coming to an end. So like the rest of state government, we have been using the remote work policy to help us with all of these challenges and to accommodate some of these things that we've been facing so that we can continue to do our work for the legislature, but not have to choose in many cases between our families and the work. So last we met was October, and you all had some questions at that time. We didn't quite make it through the whole policy. So what I would like to do is run through the policy. The directors and I did meet after our last meeting to try to address some of the questions that you had when we met last. So I think that we have done that. So as we go through, I'll point out the new revisions that we've made, as well as some of the revisions that we didn't quite get to last time, if that's okay. So then I'll run through the whole thing, and if you have questions at the end, I'm certainly happy to take them. So I'll start off I'm on page 1 of the remote work policy, right at the very top, the purpose and policy statement. So this language is really unchanged, but we did add a sentence at the very end, which says, in all instances, every effort will be made to minimize disruption to the work of the General Assembly. So you'll find that in other places in this policy, but we felt that it was important enough to bring it up to the top to emphasize how important it really is. Under general guidelines, the eligibility section was added, and we did review this the last time we met in October, but since then we added the last 2 bullets. So in order to be approved for remote work, the employee's supervisor has to determine that the employee meets this criteria. And the last 2 bullets say that the employee has to agree to complete their regular normal job duties remotely. And they also have to have network connectivity sufficient to complete the employee's job duties. That was raised last time, and we wanted to address that here. On the next page, I'll show you in just a minute that we also did address who is responsible for providing that connectivity. That came up in our last meeting as well. Other considerations, so we did reorganize some of the wording. We added this section just for the flow of the policy. And we added to the first sentence. So now it reads, an employee working remotely must be reachable during work hours to ensure communication appropriate to the employee's job duties in a time frame comparable to working on site, because we did want the communication to resemble what it would be as if somebody was in their office. So we added that sentence there. And then if you turn to page 2 at the top, This is where we added that additional sentence. The Vermont General Assembly does not provide internet connectivity for remote access. We wanted to be clear about that, that we're not providing that access for staff at home. The next section, working remotely for a limited time. Much of this section is the same as in the current policy. But we did again add to the first sentence. So now it reads, a legislative employee may be permitted and encouraged to work remotely, provided the employee is able to meet all the eligibility requirements for remote work. So that's an addition. And then the third bullet down is just a bit of a revision. It was very focused on COVID specifically before, but now we've broadened it a bit to make it a little bit more applicable. So it says, following public health guidelines as per the Vermont Department of Health, CDC, or treating healthcare provider. And then I'm moving right below those bullets. We added, again, one sentence to clarify, and that's the last sentence there. So now it says, an employee should request approval from the employee supervisor to work remotely as soon as practicable and prior to the start of the employee's workday whenever possible. We added, in the event the employee cannot meet all the eligibility requirements for remote work, the employee should use relevant leave benefits, because there could be some situations where an employee may want to work remotely, but they may lose power, right? And they're not able to, or there may be situations where they're not well enough and they do need to use their sick time. So we just want to clarify that in those types of situations, they should be using their leave benefits. The paragraph after this is standing language in our current policy, which says that as applicable, an employee who's approved to work remotely should notify their colleagues, the appropriate committee assistants, and the appropriate committee chairs as soon as practical to coordinate remote participation or reschedule as necessary. And that language is already in place. And then there are two different types of hybrid work arrangements. The first is when someone would be working remotely off-site. And again, this language is mostly the same as it is currently, with the exception of the first sentence. We added language here to now say, under certain circumstances and based on the work needs of the employee's office, an employee who meets the eligibility requirements may be permitted to work a hybrid schedule in which some of the employee's work is performed remotely, while the remainder of the work is performed on-site in the Capitol complex. So we just added language to the first part of that sentence. But I will point out to you that if you read further in this paragraph, it goes on to say that the hybrid work request will only be approved when the employee's supervisor determines that the employee can fulfill the functions of the job remotely, and performing that work will not disrupt or adversely impact the work of the General Assembly and other legislative employees. That's standing language, but we preserved it here. And then continuing to the next section, which talks about a different hybrid work arrangement, and that is on-site, when someone is on-site. This language is very much the same. It talks about when someone is working here on-site, they may be listening to a committee meeting while doing other committee work at their desks. That happens often because oftentimes people are supporting more than one committee. And again, we preserve the language that says that this type of work will not unreasonably disrupt the work of the committee. And the next sentence we flipped. So now it says the employee will coordinate with the chair or chairs to develop a plan to enable remote participation. Before, it had the responsibility on the chair. Now the responsibility is on the employee to coordinate. And then the last section, remote work is a reasonable accommodation, is standing language, but we did move it all to the end. Wanted to call it out. So as we're currently doing, if someone needs a reasonable accommodation, remote work may be a way to accommodate them. That has been in place and it's still in place. And it really just outlines that the employee supervisor and the Office of Human Resources would need to receive that accommodation, and it would be approved according to applicable laws that are currently in place.
Great.
That's the end.
Thank you, Arlene, and I appreciate you working with the staff to fold in our comments and feedback from the last meeting. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
I would just, I remember the discussion last time. I think this is much improved, and I really do think it sets up a good template for sort of working through these issues. I appreciate the work on the part of all the staff and you and the speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we find more folks working remotely? Is that continuing to increase? More folks are working?
You know, I think it's, we did go over and we looked at some of the statistics. So one of the questions that was raised, are people no longer using any of their accrued time? And we found that that's just not the case. People really are unable to work remotely if they're just too sick, which people have been, unfortunately, you know, or if their family obligations don't allow them to juggle both, and they are using their accrued time. But there have been a lot of situations just because of the pandemic, really, that people do find that they need to work remotely. In some cases, though, they're not working full days. They may work an hour or two and then come in, or they may only be able to devote half a day and the rest they have to use their accrued time for. But it really just depends on the situation. But we are finding there are more and more challenging circumstances, unfortunately, that require people really to juggle an awful lot between home and work.
You'd like a motion to approve the proposed
Still,
draft policy?
You have another witness on there, though.
We do.
Damien's listed on the, I don't know if he had anything to add or not.
Let's ask him. Damien, do you have anything to add or contribute to the remote work policy before we have a motion to vote on it?
I don't. Arlene covered it very well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
So I would move approval of the draft policy on remote work.
Great. Is there any?
Oh, I'll second.
Thank you. Any further discussion before I call the vote? All right, seeing none. Senator Ballant is absent. Senator Kitchell?
Yes.
Senator Benny?
Yes.
Senator Mazza?
Yes.
Representative Ansel?
Yes.
Representative Leclerc?
Yes.
Representative Colston is absent, and I am a yes. So the motion carries 6-0-2. Thank you, Arlene. And now let's move on to the COVID-19 notification and return to work policy.
Okay, thank you. So the next policy that you have in place, this was the 10-page policy. It's now been reduced significantly down to 3. So this is a revision of the current COVID-19 vaccination and test policy that has been in place for the staff. That policy was approved last January, but much of it, now that things have sort of come a ways with COVID-19, much of it's no longer accurate or in place. So just to refresh your memory about what the current policy was addressing, it required us to collect vaccination cards for the primary vaccine series, those two-step or the one-dose step of all the staff. So we were collecting COVID vaccine cards for everyone and attestations. We were requiring the vaccine, and for someone who didn't have their vaccinations, they were required to test weekly. They were doing that on site. So testing on site is no longer available. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the testing centers, if not all of them, are closed now. And that's happened over the last year. So they're not as readily available to be tested. The isolation guidelines that were in place in the current policy are incorrect. So they were 10 days that you would have to isolate at home. Now it's been changed to 5. I'm certain it could change again. The terminology has changed. So there was a term that was being used very often, which was fully protected vaccinated, and that terminology is no longer in play. So we've updated a lot of the language in this revision, according to the CDC and the Vermont Department of Health. And the return to work criteria has also changed. So I will walk you through these 3 pages. And again, I will point out the language that we have preserved. We did feel it necessary to preserve pieces about notification. So we do want to know when someone tests positive with COVID-19 for tracing purposes. We still feel that that's important. And I'll also point out to you where we have revised some of the language.
Great, thank you. And I just want to remind members that joint rules, House rules, Senate rules will be looking over the updated guidelines and standards for the upcoming session for the chambers and everything. So this is just focused on the staff. Thank you.
Okay, so starting with the purpose and policy statement at the top of page 1, we have removed language that required the weekly testing if someone wasn't vaccinated. Otherwise, this language is the same. It still requires employees to follow a legislative face mask policy that may be in place. We do have one in place. So we didn't remove that language. Under the definitions, we combined all of the testing. We had all of the different types of tests called out. We just combined them into this middle section. And we removed that paragraph that talked about being fully protected vaccinated because it's no longer in place. Just moving down to the bottom of page 1 under vaccination against COVID-19, this is updated language. The new terminology is staying up to date on vaccines. So of course, we're still encouraging staff to stay up to date according to the Vermont Department of Health and the CDC. So we have outlined what that means here. So it now reads, all employees are encouraged to stay up to date on COVID-19 vaccinations as defined by the Vermont Department of Health as of November 22nd. Now I'm on the top of page 2. Was defined as an individual having completed a COVID-19 vaccine primary series and received the most recent booster dose as recommended for that individual by the Center for Disease Control, because boosters are recommended for people for all different reasons now. Vaccines may be obtained at healthcare provider offices, local pharmacies, and walk-in clinics. Employees can check the Vermont Department of Health website at healthvermont.gov for changes and updates to this information, so they would know where to go. Moving further down, COVID-19 protocol for employees. This is a new section, but much of the language has been preserved. We did remove all of the pages that referenced how to report your vaccination or your vaccination status. The testing requirements have also been removed. But we did preserve here the language about reporting a COVID-19 positive diagnosis or test result. The reporting is the same. So any employee who tests positive for COVID-19, they still should be letting their supervisor know, or the Sergeant at Arms, or the Human Resources Office. And we have an email address that's been set up. Those three individuals are always in communication when somebody reports a positive diagnosis or test result. So if HR is made aware and the Sergeant at Arms is not, we notify her, we make sure the supervisor knows. So that process has been working pretty seamlessly. We did add language in the middle of this paragraph, at the top here, just to let everyone know that if they do have a positive COVID-19 test or diagnosis, they will be directed to follow the Vermont Department of Health isolation guidelines, and they are asked to seek medical care as necessary. And that is what we have been doing all along, is referring everyone to the Vermont Department of Health. The middle paragraph has been reworded. This is new language. It says an employee who is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 at work, but who is not yet tested positive is encouraged to test according to the Vermont Department of Health guidelines and to wear a mask while in the legislative workplace, or they can follow or should follow the remote work policy, which basically says you should not be here even if you have mild symptoms. Moving further down, this language is the same, and it just talks about how an employee who's eligible may use their earned sick time for any time missed due to illness or because they have symptoms related to COVID-19, and we list the applicable policies they can refer to. And then it goes on to say if an employee's health and job permit, an employee may be permitted. It used to say the employee may elect, but we changed it to they may be permitted to work remotely, a work policy until they are sufficiently recovered to come back into the workplace. Just moving down to the bottom of page 2, the return to work criteria has been changed. We removed the old isolation requirements, that 10-day provision that's no longer in place. And now we are requiring people to follow the Vermont Department of Health's isolation guidelines here. Moving over to the top of page 3. Yes.
Well, Arlene, I had just a question. May use earned sick time. I was just it's obvious. Why would we put that in relative to any other kind of use of sick leave? I would think. So it said they may use. What else would they? I guess you could go off payroll, but I was just wondering what the purpose of that paragraph was.
Right, we had put this in the original policy because we did want people to know that they could use their sick time. They can use other types of leave. If they have comp time, they can use that as well. But we wanted people to know you do have sick time. You can use it. You should be using it if you're not well enough to be in the workplace. So we spelled it out here, and we had done it in the original policy as well.
Do you have any follow-ups or?
No. It's just sort of
Stating the obvious.
yeah, that's what I'm struggling with. That's right. Stating the obvious. That's right.
It allows them to know that they can. That's fine.
There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, I was wondering if there was a particular reason for putting that in as opposed to any other, use of sick time. One would assume that it qualifies as sick time.
I see Damien's hand is up. Damien?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add here is that traditionally in the laws, we've said the use of sick time is at the employee's option. So in other words, they're not required to use sick time. They may use it if they wish to. So you could have a situation where an employee decides that using sick time isn't appropriate for them and during that pay period because they have a limited number of days or something like that. And they're concerned that they may be out across 2 pay periods. Or there can be a variety of situations, but the may use is just designed to leave it at the employee's option. And that's the way we've done it in our state's earned sick time laws too, is leaving it to the employee's discretion.
Thank you.
Okay, I am at the top of page 3, that second paragraph there where it says that if an employee has severe COVID-19, we added or a medical condition impacted by COVID-19 because now we know a lot more and we know that people can be impacted by COVID-19 in other ways. And then the paragraph following is standing language, which is in many of our policies, again, referencing accommodations that someone might need if they are ill. So in this case, they can request an accommodation.
I see a hand, Representative Ansel.
Yeah, I have a question about that first full paragraph on the top. If an employee has severe COVID-19 or a medical condition, the General Assembly will follow the guideline. And I don't think the General Assembly is called out as having a role in here anywhere else. It just seems kind of odd to me, like who in the General Assembly? Do we mean the supervisor or it just seems a little strange to me to say the General Assembly will follow.
Kind of an amorphous.
Yeah.
Or this policy will follow.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this case, in most cases, when it's referencing an employee, it would be the supervisor or human resources. I believe we added the General Assembly last time to be sort of all-inclusive. We reference an employee of the General Assembly on page 2 at the top of sort of under the COVID-19 protocols.
The General Assembly doesn't really have any capacity to act other than through legislation. And so if it just said this policy will follow, that would make sense to me, but it seems odd to say the General Assembly will.
Yeah, and I'm happy to change it. And I don't know if Damien has any thoughts about the language, but it's really easy to change.
Do you think that the impact on our, you mentioned legislation, but we do have policies that we have through different committees that help our structure, how we navigate through certain things like the pandemic? Excuse me.
I'm not sure how it ought to be phrased. I just think that it doesn't mean anything as it is because the General Assembly doesn't have any capacity to act. Sure.
Damien, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, you could say something like, the employee's supervisor and the Office of Human Resources will follow the guidance, or simply the guidance of the employee's licensed healthcare provider will be followed regarding when the employee may return to work.
Either one of those is better, I think.
Yeah. All right, so I'm hearing,
Especially since this is really for just employees.
right, so just striking the General Assembly.
Just in this one instance, or like what Arlene had indicated, there's another reference to an employee of the General Assembly.
I think that one's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just this one. Yeah.
And I think I would suggest saying the guidance of the employee's healthcare provider will be followed. I hate to use the passive voice like that, but the reason I would say that is just because there may be restrictions regarding like work in committee rooms and so forth. And so they may be able to return to work, but not in person or something like that if they have persistent symptoms or damage their immune system or other medical concerns that their healthcare provider has identified. And that would be something we deal with through our medical accommodation policy or process. Where that's a discussion that happens between the supervisor, HR, the employee, and then often if the employee does committee work, the chairs of those committees will be involved in the discussion to help troubleshoot any potential issues.
So would you restate that again, Damien, as you're proposing?
Sure. The guidance of the employee's licensed healthcare provider will be followed regarding when the employee may return to work.
Fine.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other further discussion or questions about that change? Yeah, Senator Benny.
Damien, I'm just curious, what happens if there's conflict? If for whatever reason, the healthcare provider is saying X and the employee is in desperate need of saying Y instead, and I don't know how you resolve that conflict. It sounds like the healthcare provider is dictating the terms of employment.
Yeah, so typically an accommodation is driven by the employee. I see what you're saying about if the healthcare provider is saying you can't go back to work and the employee is saying I need to go back to work. I think that we would have to take that on a case-by-case basis to some extent. I'm not quite sure what the circumstances would be, but I know that as an employer, we also have to think about liability if we're putting someone in an unsafe situation. And I imagine that there may be workarounds such as remote work under the other policy we discussed this morning. Typically will address many of the sort of infectious disease concerns about spreading the disease or being exposed to something else. But yeah, I think if there's conflict, then we may have to see if there's a creative way to address it. And then work with the employee and their healthcare provider to figure that out. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's much else that I can say there, but we have sort of the balance of concern about everyone else's health, concern about the employee's health, and potential liability if we put them in a dangerous situation. And then obviously concern about taking care of our employees who, especially if they're in a situation where they're running out of paid leave and they need the work, figuring out a way to make that happen. But this is probably to some extent a policy call for you. But I would just caution that we do have to be concerned about if we bring people back to work in a situation that puts them and their health at risk for a condition that's caused by work, then we would be liable for the cost of that condition under the workers' compensation law. So that's part of what we're trying to protect here, is our own potential liability if we put someone in a risky situation. So.
Just looking at it from both angles, you also could be putting working employees at risk at the same time. So the liability is a double-edged sword.
Yeah. I think the risk to other employees in the building is that they also get sick and then end up out of work, or members get sick and end up out of unable to perform their duties until they're healthy again. Then you have the risk if an employee has a condition that's been exacerbated by COVID, we have to figure out a way to accommodate that in a way that's also going to protect the employee's health and allow the work of the General Assembly to continue. So that may get into more of a medical accommodation discussion about, is there a way to do remote work or hybrid work on site or something like that, which we've worked out with individuals who've had concerns about COVID in the past year. So I think we could do something similar in this case and just try to be creative about that if necessary.
Is there a difference between the mandatory statement will follow as opposed to shall endeavor to follow? I'm just trying to give you flexibility in both instances.
Shall endeavor to follow would certainly provide, or shall follow to the, greatest extent possible or to the extent possible. All of those would give more flexibility to make some judgment calls there. But I don't think the current language prevents a supervisor from reaching out to a healthcare provider and saying, what if we did this? Would you allow a return to work then?
Right.
So
I would be concerned if, in fact, we did not comply with the guidance of the medical professional. That seems to raise other legal issues, and I would think would be a concern, because normally the treating physician assessment is the one that is accepted. So it becomes I would think it'd be very dicey for a supervisor to reject the recommendation of the treating physician. It's just my concern about legal implications from that as well. If you fail to do so and then something happened. So I think we're back to sort of a case-by-case facts and trying to make the best accommodation we can. But that would be my concern. Under what conditions would you not want to follow the treating physician's recommendation?
Just to answer that, if you're in your committee and another committee person has a physician who is saying, I don't want you in that room if X is present, and for whatever reason, this particular person's healthcare provider has said it's okay for you to go back now, even though X is present, you have that double-edged sword of liability coming up, and I'm just trying to search for a way to have people certainly take into account the initial employees, healthcare providers' thoughts, but not lock the legislature into a position where they're literally threatening some other employee's health and well-being at the same time.
See, Damien, did you want to jump back in?
Yeah, so there are two things I would raise. One is that all employees are entitled to request a reasonable accommodation if they have a condition that would put their health in danger because of their work, or that if they have a condition that makes it difficult for them or impossible for them to perform the functions of their job without an accommodation. The other thing that I would just note is that with this language, an alternative would be that we could add a new sentence saying the employee's supervisor and the Office of Human Resources, and I want to be careful here. I'm trying to think about this in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I would say may ask an employee if they require an accommodation to return to work. And I'll want to just double check that language with the federal ADA guidance just to make sure that that's an allowable question. We have significant restrictions under federal law about how we can ask certain questions, but I think it's okay to ask if they will require an accommodation to return to work, and that would allow them to discuss with their medical provider whether an accommodation is appropriate. But that's just an alternative approach, not necessarily something you have to move forward with. We do in the next paragraph specifically address an employee who requires an accommodation. And typically employees raise whether they require an accommodation. So it's typically employee initiated, where an employee would say, I just had back surgery, and it makes it difficult for me to sit in that position. So I need a different work environment or something like that. Or in the COVID instance, I need to be isolated. So just another possible way to approach this.
Representative Ansell.
So I'm sorry I opened this particular Pandora's box, but I'm content with the line. I'm uneasy about adding this new sentence without a whole lot more work than we've been able to do here. I think the sentence that Damien suggested initially is fine. One other possibility, just listening to the discussion, is to say all this language, the guidance of the employee's licensed healthcare provider regarding when the employee may return to work, rather than will be followed, will be taken into account, which is actually the words that Damien used. And that's a little more mandatory than some other options, but it's not, not quite as mandatory. So I will throw that out as a possible.
To be taken into account?
Yeah, will be taken into account.
Damien, do you have feedback on that?
Can you repeat the phrasing? I caught part of it, but didn't.
The guidance of the employee's licensed healthcare provider regarding when the employee may return to work will be taken into account. Since we're all passive voice here anyway.
Yeah, I'm much happier with that. I just don't like leaving it in the hands of an outside physician dictating to the legislature.
It gives it significant weight. It gives that opinion, which I think is the right thing to do.
Damien and Arlene, any feedback or flags on that, or does that meet the goal here?
I'm okay with that. I think that it is less mandatory, but it also requires us to take into account potential concerns about employees' health and well-being. And that it actually dovetails nicely with the next paragraph about an accommodation. What do you think, Arlene?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm also, as everyone's talking, I also think that in these cases, they are case by case. And if there was truly an issue, I think between the employee and the employer and, or question and with a treating healthcare provider, I would not hesitate to work with the employee and their healthcare provider. I've done it before and I wouldn't hesitate to do it again if it was something that would help resolve the situation or get an employee back to work in a way that's comfortable for everyone, while not putting anyone, either party at risk. So.
Just looking around the table, does anyone have any concerns or are we good to add that language? Good? Okay, thank you. All right, let's to the next paragraph.
Yep, the next paragraph is standing language about accommodations, which we've reviewed, and it's the same in other policies as well. The section under close contact guidance is new, and we added that because we did get a significant amount of calls about close contacts and questions about close contacts. So we just documented here, if someone believes that they've been in close contact with someone, they should be referencing the Vermont Department of Health guidance. There is a whole section on close contacts. And if it's determined that they are a close contact, then they are encouraged to test. That standing language that we have now. And then this little piece after that says employees who are a close contact and or have symptoms of test positive for or are diagnosed with COVID-19 shall follow the protocol and the return to work criteria as applicable and set forth in the policy. So really, it's just if you fall under any of these things, you just need to follow the policy. The confidentiality and privacy language is the same. And the language that follows at the very end is also the same. That's standing language in all of our policies. And that's the conclusion of this policy.
Great. Any other questions regarding this policy?
And quite a road that we've been on.
Yes, yes. I'm glad I feel like we've landed in a good place and would welcome a motion to accept this policy as amended. Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, I'll call the roll. Senator Ballant, Senator Kitchell,
Yes.
Senator Benning,
Yes.
Senator Mazza,
Yes.
Representative Ansel,
Yes.
Representative Leclerc,
Yes.
Representative Holston is absent, and I am a yes. So the policy as amended passes 602. Thank you. All right, members, the last agenda item is around the allocation of a vacant position to the Speaker's office. And Connor's going to hand out a memo that we prepared about this. So just take a moment to get that in front of you. So as you know, we have an unprecedented amount of new members joining the Assembly. We have 50 new members in the House, and we will be appointing between 8 and 9 new chairs. So we are anticipating a lot of work and support for this change. And talking with Legislative Council and the Joint Fiscal Office, there is a position that is not currently being used in Legislative Council. And so my proposal here, and we've done this in the past in different offices to help accommodate certain situations that arise, to use the position for 1 year as a pilot to see how it goes, and then revisit to see if we would need it for the second year of the biennium. But again, with this much turnover, I think we're going to need to be able to provide a lot of support to new members and especially chairs.
That's a lot of extra work, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with this, yeah.
Are there any questions?
Good idea.
I'd move that one.
What would the job title be? I'm just looking at integral in supporting new members, navigating space, unprecedented chairs, communications to constituents. What would be the, is there a job title?
I think we were talking about aid to the Speaker of the House.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it would be whatever you feel needs to be done.
Well, and it's listed in there.
Fairly broad, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, could I have a motion to approve the allocation of the vacant position to the Speaker's office? Thank you, Senator Mazza. And thank you. Any further discussion? All right, I'll call the roll. Senator Ballant, Senator Kitchell,
Yes.
Senator Benning,
Yes.
Senator Mazza,
Yes.
Representative Ansel, Representative Leclerc,
Yes.
Representative Colston is absent, and I am a yes. Motion passes 602. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So do our members. Yes.
Wow, that's a lot. Is that a record?
And all the new chairs.
So before we adjourn, I just want to thank everyone for their hard work and support in getting through these last policies. This, I believe, will be our last meeting of the Joint Legislative Management Committee this year. I just want to thank the staff. We were talking about new members. Last week was new member orientation, and it was a huge success. And the feedback I have gotten has just been tremendous. So thank you to all the staff who worked on updating the training and making it happen. So thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions or anything to raise before we adjourn? Go ahead.
Just as one of the folks not returning, I want to say it's been a pleasure to work with all of you and best of luck in future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Senator. Don't be a stranger.
Probably apply for that job.